Well, thank you for coming, everybody. I suspected that we would have a crowd as large as this on 3 to 4 on Friday afternoon. So what I wanted to do, rather than just go through the pretty stock standard CAMR meeting process, was to instigate a rolling series of project presentations. So of course I volunteered myself first. I've already had a request from Clive Harrison. He's going to be presenting at a conference in Surrey in April. He wants to be the next cab off the rank. He's coming up from Sydney to present to the CAMR group. I won't make any comments about whether the difference between Clive Harrison at the Australian Institute of Music as the academic director driving all the way up from Sydney to present at CAMR and other people who might or might not be here. So I'll just get started on this because this is also serving a second purpose. Our industry partners on our new, by our I mean Susan and I, new ARC LP, are pretty anxious to understand what's happened here in Newcastle because we're then going to replicate that around the country. So, so I'm serving two purposes here by getting that seminar process off the ground for CAMR, and also I'll upload this to Dropbox or somewhere and they can access it from there.
Phillip, will it be once a month?
Yes.
One presentation a month?
One presentation a month?
Presentation
I'd hope so. And it doesn't matter what the project is at all, whether it's a large project or a small project, whether it's something that you feel like you want to do, you've got an idea for a grant presentation, or you've got a journal article that you want to work some ideas through, or you've got a conference paper that you want to rehearse, which is what Clive's coming up for, or any of those things, so long as it's a research focus to it. So I think like the discipline meeting, I think we actually need to get something going in order for this to actually work. Okay, so having said all that, we can chop all that off the front end later, George. So this is a research presentation which is based around our, well, it's basically our final report for this ARC Linkage, which was done in partnership with Technica CPT and Newcastle Now, which is the Newcastle Business Improvement Association, and of course the ARC, the Australian Research Council, and the University of Newcastle as well. I think it's important not just to flick past this title, because this title in many ways is directing us, or had directed us through this process. We started in 2013, and I think it's important to mention that it took us 12 months to get the legals sorted out between, basically between the university and our partners, which then took 12 months from the process at the head of the process, and it's been pushed 12 months through, all the way through. And we've rolled that money through. So we actually finished the project officially in December of last year, and then we've got another 12 months towards the end of 2018 to actually report. So we're starting this process now. So it's called Creativity and Cultural Production in the Hunter. Not Newcastle, the Hunter, that will become clear in a second. And it's an applied ethnographic study of new entrepreneurial systems in the creative industries. Each one of those major terms I think is critically important. In many ways what that does is the same as for your PhD process. The title will govern the literature that you're actually engaging with and the processes and the methodology and so on that will fall out of that. So before we move on, I'd like to thank of course the ABS, but also you on Statistical Services, because we had two sets of statistical measures, and also Peter Higgs, who was one of the progenitors of the Trident methodology that has come out of QUT that we're currently using and has been used on a number of other studies. He was very, very helpful to us. And in order to pay for Peter, we have a very special thanks from Dr. Michael Meaney for his contribution of funds into this particular project, which went above and beyond.
Personal funds?
It's QA funds.
Oh, very generous.
Absolutely generous.
CAMR group.
Sexy.
So, just in terms of the researchers themselves, it is ethnographic, but most of us, as you will see by these myriad sets of pictures, were engaged in some way or another with the creative industries, and still are in many ways. You can certainly see that there. That's also the case for my colleague, Associate Professor Kerrigan, in terms of her own professional career and what she's been doing and so on. I think she was quite surprised when she saw this slide for the first time.
It's my line.
Yes. But also to Claire Williams, who was the Director of the Creative Industries faculty at TAFE for quite a long time, but was a board member on Newcastle Now. That's important to mention because our industry partners were not just partners in name only, they were actually researching with us as co-researchers. And I think that's a really important thing to mention. Claire, of course, is heavily engaged in the theatrical world in Newcastle. Evelyn is a PR person who runs Technica CPT, so she's our other partner who is co-researching as well. I couldn't find terribly many pictures of Evelyn, so she's doing King. Okay. She used to work here at the university in a PR role as well. And of course, Professor Mark Balnaves, who had also some professional experience in these early days in terms of being a young journalist and also a PR operative in Melbourne as well. So we were actually people who had worked inside the creative industries, researching what the creative industries were doing. Our methodology, of course, is ethnography, which is derived from anthropology. We all dressed up in these particular safari suits and pith helmets, and we went out into the wilds of the Hunter local government areas, and we did basically all of these things. We immersed ourselves in the creative industries in this region. We observed what was going on, we talked with people, we actually interviewed quite a number of people, actually key informants in this process. We gathered data about those groups, we collected detailed supporting data and documents relating to the groups. Most of that was primarily desktop research, and there was a hell of a lot material that you can access on the website and so on. And of course, you know, we're at the point of writing this whole process up. In fact, we're nearly finished, and I'll come to that at the end, of course. So that was our methodological approach, to basically immersing ourselves in the creative industries in the Hunter local government areas. And of course, the very first thing that we do as researchers is we simply ask the question, well, what do we already know about all of this process? And it turns out, of course, that there's quite a lot written about the creative industries as well. I just want to remind you that that title is important because there's also quite a lot written on creativity, quite a lot written on cultural production, quite a lot written on systems, a little bit about the Hunter that we drew on and so on. So all of those things are important. So the literature review wasn't just creative industries literature. We were looking at things like innovation ecosystems, smart cities, all of those things that were related to our particular topic. And of course, we accessed quite a number of reports in that about the creative industries. International ones like this Cultural Times, the first global map of cultural and creative industries, is quite a massive one. So that international one, quite not a lot, but a number. National reports, primarily out of the UK, but we also looked at ones in Brazil, in India, in the US and others as well. But this one I think was particularly important. In fact, our first set of stats was based on a similar thing to the CIIC report as well. And of course there are material that you can access from a variety of journals, and there's a couple there as well. We've since published some of the material that we've got out of this project into those journals. And of course we had a series of operational definitions. I particularly used this one from Davies and Sig Thorson because it's based on the DCMS definition, which seems to be relatively standard, but I think that's got so many holes in that definition, it's not funny. It's you could drive a truck through it basically. But in terms of the three basic components in it. But I think what differentiates the creative industries with this definition is this particular thing. They are vehicles for symbolic messages, that is, they are carriers of meaning, and that's the principal output out of this industry. If we can define the fishing industry output as fish for human consumption, or we can define the agricultural industry as agriculture that's for human consumption, or the steel industry in terms of what's... So the creative industries produce creative output, those things. There are a lot of, in that literature you'll discover there are a lot of lists of what's included inside the creative industries, and you can certainly go to the literature for that as well. But this short quote from Terry Flew I think is really important. So no matter which creative industries model, well that's a paraphrase actually, no matter which creative industries model is used, these lists consistently include design, the arts, information technology, and of course the media. And then you have a look at categories that fit inside those as well. And of course we'll place music, performing arts, visual arts inside the arts. Design, we've included architecture, fashion, graphic design. And this is really interesting, and I'll come back to why that's the case when we come to have a look at the that basic area. And of course television, radio, publishing, film, and games and software. And those categories, sectors, are pretty standard. In fact, we base this on New South Wales Trade and Industry list, which we'll get to in a second as to why that was particularly important. Actually, we'll get to it right now. In 2013, the year that we were supposed to start, the Federal Minister for Industry, who was at the time Ian Macfarlane, seemed to be quite surprised actually when he written this in the foreword to the CIIC report. He said that the creative industries contribute more than $90 billion to our economy annually in turnover and add more than $45 billion to our gross domestic product and generate annual exports of $3.2 billion. And there were more than 600,000 people working in the creative industries in Australia in 2011 and over 120,000 creative businesses. So there's the federal view. We come down to the state view. They established, in the New South Wales State Government, established a Creative Industries Task Force to develop comprehensive strategies to drive growth, innovation and productivity in the New South Wales creative industries sector. And that task force was very good. They produced a report, but Newcastle and the Hunter region was not included. We just were not there, which is one of the drivers for us putting this project together. And in 2014, Newcastle City Council identified the creative industries as central to the new knowledge economy, and they recognised that they are a key element in Newcastle's economic development strategy. In fact, they are now embedded in the economic development strategy that Nathaniel Bavington, the Economic Development Officer at the City Council, has since published and made public since that particular statement. So, what are we dealing with? We're dealing not just with Newcastle, so it's not a study on Newcastle, but it's a study on the 11 local government areas in the Hunter region. So it includes the Upper Hunter, but it also includes the Great Lakes and Gloucester. That's important to recognise because our second statistical measure doesn't take these two in. So there's a slight disparity between the two. So very difficult to kind of take the focus away from this area and say, well, what the hell is going on up here as well? Quite surprising what's going on right across the Hunter. Of course, as you would expect, just as Newcastle feeds into, as part of the hinterland for Sydney, this hinterland here is also feeding into what's occurring in the city as well. So mostly around, I would say around 80% of the action's actually occurring here, in the Lake Macquarie, in the Newcastle and the Maitland local government areas, primarily, as we'll see shortly. As we'll see now, actually. So in terms of that first statistical measure, you could say that the creative industries contribute $1.29 billion to what is called gross regional product and gross value add of $534.071 million. Total working in terms of all industries in the Hunter region is 330,847, and of that figure there are 6,535 self-declared through the census and measured through the ABS stats. That's important to keep in mind. It changes across the two measures, but it's important to keep in mind when we come to the end of this report as well, because that's something I want to say about that. I think it's important also to recognise that out of that particular group, there are primarily 5,810 employed, but 719 of that group are actually self-employed, who are actually running their businesses themselves. Anyway, I'll come back to that as well. Males and females, it's predominantly weighted around 4,000 to and maybe 2.5 to between males and females as well. You can see the breakup of each one of those areas, whether it's television, film, radio, publishing, etc., in relation to each of the local government areas. And of course, you know, here's Newcastle at 1,061 in terms of advertising. This is the largest area, by the way, 2,870 people out of the total working in advertising and design. Anyway, you can go through those stats as well, and they seem to fall pretty much as you would expect in one way or another.
2 people claim to be working in film.
Yes.
Newcastle.
Yes.
Really?
We'll come back to that in a second.
Interesting statistics.
It is. I think this is an interesting graph in terms of the gender divide in the creative industries. Here's the total figure, and there's an age relationship going on there. So this is males, and this is females, and you can see at a certain age, then males kind of continue on, increase a little bit, 35 to 44, and start to plateau and drop off at that particular point. But 25 to 34, females start to disappear out of the creative industries at that particular point. And continue to drop off right across. So I think there's an interesting set of ideas to be generated from that particular graph. So there's information there from that first statistical measure, which we derived primarily from the same lists as the CIIC report was derived from. This one's different. We're actually using the Trident methodology that Peter Higgs and so on had developed through QUT. They're using a different geographical allocation. These are statistical area 4s, not, which is an ABS category, not local government areas, which you'll see here takes out those 2 LGAs that I was talking about earlier. So the stats are not literally comparable, but looking roughly at the same basic things. We paid for 2011 stats from that census, but also we were lucky enough to get the 2016 as well to make some sort of comparison. In terms of numbers employed, the share of the workforce, the total workforce, and of course in terms of share of creative employment. I will say quickly that it's called the Trident methodology because there are 3 primary ways to think about people working in the creative industries. There are specialists, there are what they call support workers, which is your 42. And of course, people who are embedded in other industries who are primarily working with video, working with audio, working with text and so on. So you can see the numbers here. These are the people that you would expect to think of as people in the creative industries and not think about the incredible numbers that are working as support people inside the industry that are also constituting the industry, and not also think about, and that's a bigger number than this one, the people who are working elsewhere. For instance, like Patrick, I can't remember his last name, who, one of our students who was a video maker who worked for a long time, he's back in town now working at the university, worked for the police, New South Wales Police, shooting videos for them on as they were going out to crime sites and so on. So people like him are actually counted there as well. This figure, share of workforce is around increase from 2.8 to 2.9%. So like the other figure, approximately 3% of the total workforce is working in the creative industries. I think that's a bigger number, but I'm going to get to that shortly. You can see here, I won't dwell on this for too much longer, the stats as well, just in terms of total earnings. But I think, have I got mean income up here? No, I'll go back for a second. I haven't got everything that's actually in the report up here, just some of the general things, by the way. You'll see here, if we have a look at it, that most of the income is being earned in this category here by support workers. And that's a fairly wide category, and we're talking about all of those people who go into either manufacture or work in offices or behind the scenes or whatever to support what activities are happening here. And of course embedded people are just a little bit below these figures here as well. That's increased, that's increased, that's increased, and of course the total number has increased.
So what does the embedded category represent?
People like that video maker working inside another industry, but still basically working as a practicing their craft, yeah. So people who are web designers or so on, but working for BHP, for instance, or the university, whatever. Yeah, those sorts of people. I think this is interesting because this is another study done on the Northern Rivers Arts and Creative Industries for Arts Northern Rivers. But what it does, and I've got it as yet to go back and check to see whether the methodology used was the Trident methodology, because then we can actually make a real point of comparison. We then wind up, because they compared what was happening in the Northern Rivers with these other regions. Luckily for us, one of them was the Hunter. So we can take these stats from 96, 2001, 2006 and lay them with 2011 and 2016, and we got some sort of trend figure. Whether that's terribly reliable or not, it would depend on whether that's Trident methodology that underpins what's going on there. The other thing I wanted to point out, that over the life of this program we've started to see an increasing use in these terms: ecosystems, ecologies, networks and systems. In fact, this is comes from a document from Nathaniel Bavington, from the Economic Development Officer at Newcastle City Council. He's increasingly talking about innovation ecosystems, and he's also talking about systems within systems within systems within systems. And in fact, that's a direct quote from Nathaniel as well. We also have seen here at the university, in fact in our own school, this notion of ecosystem being at play. And he's one of the ones that we're actually engaged with here. In fact, Simon put this together, Simon Weaving put this together. Part of the lit review that we did, I was really interested to see where's the term innovation ecosystem come from, and you can trace it quite a way back to when the Europeans and the British Empire were actually at loggerheads. And there was I don't remember whether a German politician or a manufacturer, but they came up with the first term, which was business system. And that got used for a while, and then it mutated into ecosystem, and then it's become innovation ecosystem. And I suspect that that's a lot more to do with what Peter Watson called the modern incoherence, which is the art-science split, the romanticism versus rationalism and so on. That's very typical of Europeans. We're much more comfortable with that term than we are with that term. And I think that's a discursive and ideological problem. The other thing that you strike when you start looking at the world through this way is that, for instance, if you have a look at Marcus Westbury's book on creative cities and so on, he tends to talk a lot about top-down, bottom-up, top-down, bottom-up. But he also talks a lot about systems as well. So there's a little dissonance actually occurring inside some of this literature as well. This, in fact, is the model that we're particularly interested in. And all of those that you had seen before, for us, fit neatly in that circle. Very little accommodation of that and that, but they fit neatly in that circle. So with that as background, this is how we've laid out our report. Every one of those sectors, advertising, design, publishing, film, television and so on, sits inside our report and is covered like this. So we give a brief history, 1 or 2 pages of history of, for instance, architecture in Australia. We then outline the structure of that particular industry, sometimes diagrammatically, sometimes verbally, etc. We then, remember it's about entrepreneurial systems, we then have a look at the various business models inside those particular sectors, whether it be performing arts or whether it be in television or whatever. How do these people go about making their money? And how has that actually changed with the digital world? Basically not very much at all, actually, in terms of what we've discovered. So when we look at business models, we're actually looking at revenue streams. There is an argument inside, particularly inside business and law, that particular literature, about what constitutes a business model. Sometimes it's, the whole mission, it's everything that the whole business does in terms of its aims, etc. And there's a whole other school that says it's primarily revenue streams. So we've gone for the second one. So we've outlined the revenue streams there. What do people actually do inside these structural components of each one of these sectors? For instance, what do you do inside a network radio station, and so on. We did cite you, Harry. Oh, and who are the important people that you would encounter? So this is really valuable information. This is going to go up on the web to be publicly accessed. And then we moved to the Hunter Region. We looked at books that were being produced. We looked at newspapers that were being produced. We looked at magazines and so on. So you can take each one of these sectors and then split it into its own component parts as well. So that tree diagram that I gave you before, we could add another layer underneath that one as well. So from now on, we're going to see a lot of pictures. Once again, you can see there's a hell of a lot going on. And what I'm going to do with these pictures, I'm just going to draw a few things out for you. This is some of the venues, etc. Obviously, these are very, very famous as well. Newcastle Conservatorium, lots of festivals going on, lots of stuff happening up in the the lower Hunter, in terms of the big acts that used to come to the city, basically primarily moved up there. That's had an effect on studios, working musicians and so on, and certainly on venues. But in each one of these sectors, there are some amazing things going on. Morgan Evans, a former student of ours, is now signed to, I think it's Warner's in the United States. He's working in Nashville. He's had 3 or 4 #1 country hits. He comes back every so often and so on. So Morgan's doing really, really well. I think we need to mention people like Capri Gall and Newcastle Improvised Music Association. But not just in terms of popular music, but things happening. Lake Macquarie Philharmonic Orchestra, there's quite a lot going on. We've just been through the Jazz Festival as well. Folk Club, I've got a big section in the report on this. Andy Firth's big band is really an interesting thing that's going on there, the number of CDs that Andy Firth has. The Hunter Ukulele Orchestra, there's many, many things going on. And these are really just an indication of what's happening. In terms of visual arts, Felicity, you may recognise this person here. Jonathan
That's the
Biggins
one.
and so on.
Oh, is it?
That was him a long time ago.
Yeah, but
It
quite.
doesn't look all that different, weirdly.
It doesn't look different,
It
weirdly.
doesn't look all that different from
Yeah.
now. He hasn't aged too
So there are people who've been through this scene in Newcastle who've gone on and done all sorts of interesting things. One of the things that surprised me about the performing arts, particularly in the city, was the comedy and the renaissance of stand-up that's actually going on. Places like the Crown and Anchor and so on. Dance schools, really significant in not just here in Newcastle but also in terms of the Hunter. Surprising number of venues. And as I said before, lots of things going on, not just in Newcastle, but all over. This dance school in Muswellbrook is really quite significant as well. What else have we got here? Lake Macquarie, surprising things going on over in Lake Macquarie as well. Many, many things happening in Maitland and so on. So lots of things happening. In terms of visual arts, then you probably recognise some of these people. Her work, Nick Hensel's work, is pretty astounding. Quite a number of photographers, very successful photographers actually, working in the Hunter Region. In fact, I'm very, very surprised. And of course the old, very, very famous people who've been located here as well. Actually, I can't remember this guy's name, but if you can ever check his website out, just go and have a look at it. He does amazing things, amazing things. I will tell you a couple of stories as well. Murrurundi Art Prize, things that are going up in terms of Gloucester, all over the place. Arts Upper Hunter is a really significant organisation. If you haven't been to their website, I suggest you go and have a look. It's really quite large, but they've got access to all sorts of things going on right across Dungog, Singleton, Cessnock, and so on. I'll just pull this out quickly and tell you what's happened here. Camera up here on this pole. Camera up, there was another pole over here. This is the building of the Student Centre. The photographer had a link back to the building site's main office, to a server there, which was linked back to his server in Melbourne, which was then at one point operated from a laptop on the Amazon in South America, because these two cameras up here were taking stills of the building. And I find that story particularly astounding of what's actually possible as well. In terms of architecture, this is probably the most mature creative industries in the region. This group, for instance, DWP Suitors, are working all over Asia, India, China, South Pacific and so on. But you've also got smaller companies like Hack and Liquid and so on. So let's just say that I was going to say they're cemented into the region, but let's not go there.
Don't draw your own conclusions.
That's right. It was. Fashion. Don't forget that we're not just talking on the you could say the boutique or the arty end of any of these industries. We're including from commercial right through all of them, which is why you need to think about the retail outlets, fashion retail outlets right across the valley. That's a really significant part of what's actually going on, as well as, for instance, small boutiques like High Tea with the Fung sisters are doing some really interesting things. In fact, they've drawn back from their international work quite a lot. Basically, they're all starting to have children and want to work closer to home. They don't want to be in Milan or in anywhere else anymore. Jean Bass has done quite well in terms of, and if you've not been and have a look at some of her work and so on, I suggest that you do. But let's not forget Rundle's has been embedded in, particularly in the city, for quite a long time and are still there as well. In terms of advertising and design, I'll come back to your question of PR here. I think one of the really interesting things that I personally was a little surprised about, and I shouldn't have been, was that you have advertising agencies, design agencies and PR agencies scattered mainly all around the city, and I cannot tell what is the difference between those three in terms of what they do, which is why
a lot of universities are integrating marketing, PR and advertising.
Yes.
University of New South Wales always put advertising,
Yep.
for a long time had them together.
Well, in terms of what the industry is doing, it's basically just converged. And you know, they might have started as a PR agency, but they're doing design, they're doing advertising and so on. They might have started as an advertising agency, but they're doing design, they're doing video, they're doing PR, they're doing a lot. And I think that's really interesting. One of the other things I think that's really interesting, when you go and have a look at, and this will come up in our conclusions as well, for instance, Tommy Rock Studios Just take a wander down to Newcastle West in Hunter Street and stand outside Tommy Rock Studios of an evening, if you want to stand there for a while, and they've got a video screen that says, we do this. And it's really interesting what Tommy Rock recording studios do. It's almost the same as these people do. They make videos, they make websites, you know, they're a model agency, they do all sorts of things. So I think that convergence is really interesting for us. So this group is, I think, really quite interesting, primarily because of, I think, when we get to film, this has been quite significant to what's happening. So there are some really interesting things going on, by the way. In terms of publishing, once again, I think one of the more mature industries. We tend to think of, you know, the boutique end of things as well, and not remember that Fairfax Media and so on are definitely part of what's going on in terms of publishing. We're talking about writing primarily. Lots of magazines happening right across the region, actually. This one's really interesting. You probably have not been to, well, maybe I'm just the only one, been to a doctor's surgery and not seen this magazine in there somewhere. This was a really interesting one. This was only ever online. This was run by a designer who was actually a working musician, Steve Dunkley. It's since ceased. Jay Ford is really interesting. Jay used to work as a news presenter on Prime Television. Slipped out of that. She's been signed to Pan Macmillan. She's produced 6 novels so far, and she's on to a 7th.
Jane Ford.
Jay, J-A-Y-E. Ford. She's really quite. She runs a little group. It's not a little group actually. It's quite large. It's called Partners in Words, and they meet over at the Prince of Wales Hotel upstairs. You have a meal. They bring along someone from the publishing industry. I spoke at it once, some years ago.
There's also Edsol Publishing in Wollongong.
Yeah. Well, this is the other thing that I think that's going to pop up once we start reporting. There's so much going on there. We haven't been able to capture it all. We really haven't. I would point out people like Mark McLean from Hunter Press, who's doing some really, really interesting things. McLean's Booksellers, of course. This one's really interesting, this magazine called F-A-C-O-N, Face On. I never really know how to pronounce it. It's a French word, I think.
PR student working there now.
Yeah, well, Lara Lupish has worked all over. This is another one of the common stories, is people leave Newcastle. I forget which suburb. I think she might have come from Wall's End. Or
She's the daughter of the Lupishes.
I'm sure she is.
You know, famous Lupishes.
The famous ones.
Their names have gone out of my head. They're famous. We can't think of who they are. Famous immigrants.
Yes.
From Russia. Is it Russia? The Lupishes.
I think so. I think so. She talks about her grandma quite a lot, actually.
Yeah.
She's worked well all over the world, but she's worked with some very, very famous people, primarily in terms of makeup and so on. But then she came home and has really instigated quite a lot. And I think that's a feature of what's happening in the Hunter region as well. So just check that out. That's given a lot of work to a lot of different people, including photographers like my son, who has the same story. Grew up here, moved away, became quite successful, and has brought his business from Melbourne back up into Newcastle. And anyway, that's another story altogether. Hidden Hamilton, if you haven't read that book, I suggest that you do. And if you haven't read that one, then I suggest you do as well. Maybe go down.
In Sticks Creek is good too.
Yes, it is. That's Mark's, one of Mark's short ones. Radio, Harry, you recognise most of these logos and so on. Discovered things like Radio Rema, and of course things that are going on up the valley. All the major networks actually represented here in one way or another. Great Lakes FM, we mustn't forget the community stations, what's happening, and of course ABC all across the board as well. Do they still have this logo, Harry?
They do, but NX doesn't.
No, it's
Ah.
FM
It's
now.
FM now.
Yes.
Or they get
This one, I think, is really interesting. Sean Ison, once again a former student of ours, decided that he really wanted to work in radio. So he built his own radio station primarily, but primarily online. He's got a number of apps like this one, Oz Radio Search, which you can of course use. But it's really interesting. This he brings in material from all over the world, from the UK, from the USA, puts it together in radio programs, in other words packages, on-sells it to free-to-air again all over the place, in all of these places. and he had a sales team in North America and in Europe. He's since stopped that. But what he's also done is he's extended his work. He's bought, I think, I can't remember the exact number, 74 different licenses right along the Hume Highway, and runs the same country. Yeah, narrowcasting basically. The same country music radio program all along the Hume Highway, and you can imagine what sort of audience that he's going to get there. So he's doing quite well. In fact, he's had a bit of a run-in with APRA, and they managed to resolve their the problems that they had in terms of his payments back to them and so on, and he now agrees that they're really quite pleasant to deal with. Him and his lawyers dealt with them quite pleasantly. So he's a really interesting find. Same sort of thing I think we've got going with Bar TV here as well, which Susan might say a little bit more about. They've gone, I think, from strength to strength. A couple of young fellas who decided that they wanted to get into the sports game and sell sports vision straight to pubs and clubs and so on, which they did do. And of course you've still got NBN here as well. You've got people like John O'Brien, who I think is a screenwriter, who lives in TV screenwriter up in the Upper Hunter. This is, I think, a really interesting little business. Well, it's not a little business, it's quite big. These guys work all over the country and have international clients and so on. They're a post-production house primarily. They're just tucked in up in here, or they used to be, up in here. And of course, where do we fit someone like Anthony Scully, who's running ABC Open? Is he television? Is he film? What is he? Is he radio? He's Anthony Scully. And of course, this has all had to cope with massive changes with the advent of things like for television, in terms of Netflix and so on. Anyone here been to a Video Easy store lately?
It's now a vending machine.
Yes. Yep. So, and of course, what's happening with all of this convergence into your flat screen at home, which gets us to film. And once again, you'll recognise this face, and you'll probably recognise this one. But we tend to think in terms of consumers, in terms of film. Lots of festivals going on, French Film Festival, the Shootout, of course, early on, what was going on, Bollywood, etc. I'm really keen, I've been reading lots of stories about the Italian Film Festival and the guys running it out of Hamilton. I'm really keen to be going to the next one. So lots of things going on here as well, but also lots of things happening on the production end, quite surprising. I say this every time, but if you haven't seen Mikey's Extreme Romance, then you actually really need to do yourself a favour. Get a copy of this movie and watch it. It's called Mikey's Extreme Romance.
It's not to everyone's
Download it on iTunes.
You can download it. No, it's not to everyone's
It's
taste.
definitely not to mine.
No.
Mikey's
It's still a very
Extreme.
good film.
It's still a very good film. As was, of course, Young Einstein, Tomorrow When the War Began, which is shot up here, Black Rock, which you recognise, Judith. Newcastle, yeah, not so crash shot critically, etc. But I think that a number of people involved in that have made their start. I came across another report. I mentioned it to you, Susan, about another film that's Hollywood funded and shooting up the valley as well. I mentioned it to you 3 or 4 weeks ago. With Zach Garrett.
Doing something.
Yes,
I saw
inside it as well.
Los
Love
Angeles.
Zach Garrett.
Drinks with them.
What I will mention very quickly is this organisation, Screen Hunter, who I think have been quite pivotal in terms of what's been going on here as well. Also mentioned people like Ian Hamilton and his crew with Honeymoon in Kabul, that particular film. And I think Jamie actually crewed for Ian on that particular process as well.
What
So-
about that student whose film got shown in LA?
Stuart McBatney. Yeah.
How's that going?
Well, he got a contract to make another film, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think you did.
Which gets us to, I think, this is the last one actually, electronic games and interactive software. I think this is probably the least mature of the industries, and I mean, it's like you'll use the word intelligence. I mean this in terms of its development as an industry in the region. There are certainly some things going on, such as Bohemia Interactive Systems, which is located up near Williamtown, around Port Stephens. Really quite a massive enterprise, but contracts with the Defence Force. And same with these particular here, these virtual environments, training environments and so on, going on around the region. Pockets of these things happening all sorts of places. And of course, in terms of games, there's just a few things spotted here. There's some up in Newcastle West. I think this simulator is still up there. And of course, VRXP in Watt Street. And to my mind, this is a bit like the penny arcade. This business is going to last for 3 or 4 years until it all becomes manageable down and goes into the home.
And the one in Charlestown on the corner.
There's quite a
Do
few.
you include the VR lab at the university in there?
We include as much as we possibly can, Deb. We haven't been able to capture absolutely everything, but we can't forget that part of this industry is also these nationals, and are they multinationals?
Yeah.
Yeah, working particularly in the malls and so on, supplying what's going on.
Question?
Yep.
I know the scope had to have parameters around it, but
Yep.
is there anything that's being done on actual venues?
We've done stuff for theatrical venues. We've done stuff on cinemas. We've done stuff on music venues. So we've done, we have.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking about that place at Tyres Hill that's just sprung up in the corner too. It's like a gamers.
Yes, right on in the old cinema, just up from Terry Latham's recording studio. Yes,
Gomez and student did a thing on it.
yes. So lots of co-working spaces have been developed around the region, in Maitland, in Lake Macquarie, and certainly here in Newcastle. Forgot where I was for a second. Some are being instigated by, say for instance, Lake Macquarie Council, but most of them in the city here are either come out of design houses or film houses or some sort of production house as an adjunct to their own business. I think that's important to realise as well. There's a lot of diversification in terms of gaining incomes here as well. So lots of things going on. This is just a quick description of what's happened at the production hub, which is Gavin Banks, unlimited access, and Olivia Rowley. 2020 internet, air conditioning, soundproof meeting rooms, I would debate that. Workshop design area, event venue, and so on. And you can brand your own workstation, put your own picture there if you wish to. But a lot of cost savings going on by making sure that people have got facilities. And it's not just working in terms of film or design and so on, but it's also working with art spaces, performance spaces, and so on. Lots of organisations trying to support what's going on with the creative industries in the city and even broader. I would suggest that some of them are really quite boosterist in the way that they are presenting what's happening, but most of them I think are doing some really interesting things, like the Newey Awards and so on, this Slingshot Accelerator program, which is associated with the university as well. And these guys have been around for quite some time, an association between Octopod, This Is Not Art, and of course Renew, Newcastle. They've been doing some really interesting things. For people who originally started working on the fringe, I think they've actually, people like Chris Saunders have worked their way into the mainstream, I think quite significantly. So lots of support going on. All of this will be up on Hunter Creative Industries website soon. I'm racing Susan to the end. I don't know. So there's lots of information going to be up there. What will primarily be there is pretty pictures like this. Each one of these sectors inside our report will have its own page with its own cover, so you can download the full report, you can download an executive summary, or you can just simply go to radio and have a look there, or publishing and have a look there. You can have a look at architecture or whatever. We've even got I can't see it. There's a lit review, operational methods and methodology.
Second last one.
That one, there. There as well. So the full report will be there, or you can just simply go and have a look at what it is that you think is going on in that particular sector inside the area that you're interested in. And that's one of the things that we said we would do when we put the grant application in, is we would make all of this information accessible to the public. So what do we think is actually happening in terms of the creative industries in the city? Well, they're obviously diverse, and they are certainly continually dynamic. There's nothing static about any of these things. In fact, even from 2014 through to now, we've seen some quite marked changes. Some sectors are, of course, mature, while others are simply emerging. I would actually like the City Council or someone to actually really push and promote the games and electronic side of things, because I think a lot of work for all the other sectors will come out of that process. One of the things that we had to get past, and we still have to get past, is that there are culturally specific beliefs and assumptions about what is creativity, what are the creative industries, and so on. And I think that plays a major part in actions taken by all of these institutions and the individuals involved. Many tend to see creative industries using only their own specific sectoral lenses. For instance, when the people from design talk about the creatives in the city, they're talking about the designers, as though there are no other creatives in the city. So we had to get past that as well. Social and cultural value of these industries does not always equate to financial value, which where we come back to support workers and specialists and so on. For instance, you would know this, Felicity, Metropolitan Players are a big organisation once they get rolling with their own warehouse out at Cardiff. They put on really big shows, which I think are, for the few that I've seen, are equivalent to many around the world. You know, cast of 120, 150, depending what's going on. That's crew and cast and orchestra and so on. But I would say that it's the principals that get paid.
No, that no one gets paid.
No one at all?
Gets paid.
No.
Okay, so it's a profit share.
No, it's not even, it's an amateur company.
Okay.
And if anyone gets paid, it'll be the sound guys
Yes.
and the microphones.
Yep.
And the musos in the orchestra.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
No one on stage gets paid.
That's what I'm talking about when, if we go back to the original stats and say, well, there are 8,000 people working in the creative industries no, there are many, many, many more working in the creative industries in this region, and they all spend money in one way or another. Out of my own area, we've got the largest online provider of instruments in Australia, in Newcastle, in Muso's Corner, and you walk in there and you can see all of this equipment. Who buys this stuff? Well, it's not those people who register as musicians in terms of census or and therefore the ABS stats, etc. It's usually all those amateurs and pro amateurs that are supporting what's going on in terms of that industry and that sector. Muso's Corner would not be able to survive without them. Same as I was going to say Shockley's. What's the name of the art place that's moved to Hamilton? Eckersley's, that's the one. We also tend to be focused at our urban centre. In the same way as when people say we're going to do something about the creative industries in the state, they are thinking about Sydney and they don't think about Wagga, they don't think about Tamworth or whatever. It's just Sydney-centric. We could say that's a very similar thing occurring here in the Hunter region as well. We tend to be very Newcastle or Novo focused, point of term. I also think, just from our discussion of advertising and design and PR, etc., I think a lot of these industry structures are in fact quite fuzzy, not just around the edges anymore, but even in terms of what the industry is and how it can be composed. And as I said before, when you read our report, you'll understand why entrepreneurial systems are adapting to the pressures of globalisation and digitisation. There wouldn't be, well, there was one actually, and that's David, who runs Cooksville Books and Records, David?
Oh yeah, David.
You know who I mean, don't you?
Yeah.
Refuses to have a website, refuses to use email.
Marshall?
No, I don't think so. Anyway, you know who I mean. That was the only company that
McLean, weirdly, I think he's.
I think it is, yes, who did not have any social media, that was not online, had a website or any of those things, nothing. If you wanted to deal with him, you needed to go to the store. But most of the business models that are being used inside those companies are really just extensions of fairly traditional business models, brokerages, service and so on. And we drew on US academic Michael Rapper's work to kind of compare and contrast what was going on there as well. Companies and individuals become increasingly diversified in generating income streams, hence my discussion of Tommy Rock Studios and the design agencies and so on. And of course there's a rapidly growing trend towards outsourcing, freelancing and the casualisation of the entire workforce. I came across a book the other day from David Weil, W-E-I-L, called well, I can't remember what it was, well, but the concept he was pushing was the notion of fishering, so cleaving things off out of the main organisation, contracting to them. It's much cheaper for them and so on. So that's kind of writ large across the creative industries. Most operatives that we've come across, certainly in our interviews, quite a lot of them are working cross-sectorally, so people are just not located just in television or just in music or just in performing arts. They're working across all sorts of areas. Basically to gain an income. So in other words, multiple tasks equals one income. I went through the same thing myself, probably through late 80s through into the 90s as well. So there's a great deal of mobility between professions, and operatives in the creative industries are specialised vertically as well as multi-skilled horizontally. Also rely, as I mentioned before, on amateurs and pro-amps to support industrial structures. The gift economy, and I deliberately put this word in here, is enormous from what we can gather through our qualitative research. in comparison to what the ABS stats are actually telling us.
Philip, what do you mean by the gift economy? Sorry.
You know, if there are 150 people all volunteering, they are giving something into that particular organisation.
Right.
That organisation, if it rehearses, say, in at the Civic, they have to get out. They have to come in from Lake Macquarie, maybe by taxi, pay for their petrol. They have to feed themselves and so on. They're actually generating a lot of. It's a gift to the economy, and it's not being accounted for.
Thanks.
And new occupations such as social media manager, transmedia storyteller, technopreneur, digital strategist, etc., are emerging at an exponential. We've got a creative technologist in town at an exponential rate. So things are, as I said at the front of this, quite dynamic. They are constantly on the move. And I think this is really interesting as well. We've got quite a number of examples of people who have worked and still are oriented towards the global, but are located here, and find that here, particularly in the Hunter region, is a really good place to be if you want to bring children up, if you want to live well and so on. So they are working in New York, maybe for 6-8 weeks, coming home, doing some gigs maybe in Western Sydney, some up here and so on, and then going back out again when the next task comes up. David Fitzgerald, who does a lot of work with Metropolitan Players and so on, and also with the Conservatorium, does a lot of tours with big musicals through the Middle East, through the United States, through Europe and so on. He does that for 8, 9, 10 weeks, comes home, does some small ops here, goes off again. And I think there's quite a lot of those people here as well. There wouldn't be, even at the Renew level in the city, people who are not online, who are pulling customers in from around the world. So they're not just located there in King Street, but King Street is being taken out to the world. And we have a series of publications that have come out of the report itself. Thank you very much.